today we have with us a very special guest in this series of interviews that we are doing focusing on one of the fastest developing relationships on the Indo-Pacific, the Australia-India relationship. Dr. Parminder Sachdev is a professor of neuropsychiatry at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. He also holds the positions of a co-director at the Centre of Healthy Brain Aging and the clinical director of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney. Dr. Sachdev has carved a niche for himself in neuropsychiatry by working on movement disorders as well as on dementia and pre-dementia syndromes. A very interesting aspect of his work also relates to understanding the ethno-psychological concepts in Maori culture in Australia. His path-breaking work in neuropsychiatry has won him many accolades, such as the Scientist of the Year for Biomedical Sciences in 2010, and being awarded the Founders Medal by the Australian Society for Psychiatric Research in 2011. He has also been appointed as the Member of Order in Australia for his outstanding contribution to medical research in neuropsychiatry. Welcome, Dr. Sachdev. It is truly such a privilege to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to speak to you, Rami.
Let me begin by asking you about your experience in India and Australia. You've obviously completed your training from premier medical institutes in both the countries. What has your experience been like?
So my formative years actually were in Delhi at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, where I did my MBBS and MD in psychiatry. And I think that was a very exciting and perhaps some of the best years of my life, mainly because there was a lot of intellectual ferment. So you can see at AIMS, it used to attract, and it probably still attracts some of the best minds in medical science. And they were both competitive as well as cooperative in the various activities. So it was really a very exciting environment to be in. And I learned a lot in those days. And I think it was also, of course, it's also a period of maturation for somebody. When I came to Australia, in fact, I came to Australia via New Zealand. And in fact, my Maori work was in New Zealand because that's where the Maori population is, although there is a significant Maori population in Australia as well, but it's very scattered, really. But of course, New Zealand has a very large Maori population. And I went there as a trainee, as a registrar in psychiatry. And I was immediately confronted with the contrasting cultures. Firstly, the cultural change, because it was the first time I had moved out of India. And so I, of course, met the European culture, in which is the large, dominant New Zealand culture. And then, of course, the Polynesian Maori culture. And in fact, the two had started to actually interact much more with each other. Previously, there had been a lot of separation, but there was some attempt at integration of the two cultures as well, at least at a superficial level. And I certainly was struck, especially working in psychiatry and having to deal with the European, or what they call the Pākehā New Zealander, and then the Maori New Zealander, and the Maoris were overrepresented in psychiatric institutions. So that cultural contrast came to the fore, and I became very interested in Maori culture. It's very robust and old culture. And I looked at some ethno-psychological concepts in that culture, which had an influence on psychiatric presentations and the way we dealt with psychiatric patients. And I also looked at a paradigm for psychotherapy with the Maori patients. So that was very interesting period for me. That was about nearly 4 years I was in New Zealand. And then I moved to Sydney thereafter. And my interests actually was always in the brain-mind relationship. And I took up this opportunity to work at the Neuropsychiatric Institute, which I've been leading now for over 30 years. And that really was a place where I saw a lot of patients at the borderland between neurology and psychiatry. So they had brain diseases, but the manifestation was in the form of thinking, behavior, and emotion. really. So they present with psychiatric symptoms, but we know that they have a brain disease underlying that, which is clearly identifiable. And that's how I got interested. But my university experience in Australia as a student, wasn't very rich, because I really did not attend university. I did my PhD. I submitted a PhD at university, but I was working in the hospital, and it was the work that I had done in New Zealand, which largely formed the PhD. So my university experience has been more as a faculty member at UNSW, which has been since 1993. So a fairly long time. And that has been a rich and interesting experience as well. Although my work has been more with the Faculty of Medicine rather than the larger university community.
Fantastic. It seems like, you've had some great experiences traversing from New Zealand to Australia and studying the Maori culture, It's fascinating to know that you used aspects of that for your comparative study. But having said that, you've also focused a lot on healthy brain aging. Could you tell us a little bit more on that?
So certainly, working at the Neuropsychiatric Institute, I used to see a lot of patients with dementia. And I became more and more interested in researching dementia. So the way we wanted to look at dementia was to actually establish what we call longitudinal cohorts. These are large groups of participants, healthy people, healthy older people that we recruit from the community, and we follow them over a period of time. In fact, some of these studies have gone on for 15 years. And we look at the ones who develop cognitive impairment and decline and go on to develop dementia. So we want to identify the factors, the risk factors, and the factors that protect people against developing dementia. So that really has been one of the major areas of work. And we actually have had 4 longitudinal studies that have been going on for a long period of time, including a study of centenarians and near centenarians, so people over the age of 95 that we've been studying. So from that, essentially, we looked at a number of risk and protective factors for dementia. And then we tried to translate them into intervention trials to see whether we can actually delay the onset of dementia, or at least slow the progression of cognitive change with aging. And in fact, we just completed a trial, a very large trial called Maintain Your Brain, where we looked at different interventions in people to see whether that could help keep their brains active and healthy for a longer period of time, so that their decline in memory and other cognitive functions is slowed down and their dementia will be pushed back. The idea is that as you probably know, with dementia, there have been a lot of attempts to try to find treatments, but we still don't have effective treatments for most types of dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease, which has been a major focus of research, but we don't have any treatments, effective treatments. We don't have a cure for the disease. So at present, still the major focus has been trying to see whether we can delay its onset, because we know that the prevalence, the risk for dementia doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. So if you could push it back by 5 years, you can actually halve the risk, really, to some extent. So that has really been the major focus that we've been working on.
Dr. Sachdev, this is personally very interesting to me because I have a 100-year-old grandmother who's going to complete 100 years and who suffered from dementia now for about 6 or 7 years. And, so it's very interesting to me because she was not a smoker. She was not a drinker, a fairly active person with no medical history, great health, touch wood, and still has great health except dementia. So what do you think are the contributing factors for this to develop, or is it genetic?
Yeah, so that's very interesting because, see, when we look at the overall, say, risk at a particular age, we find that when you are in your 80s, the risk actually goes up to 1 in 4 in the late 80s. And then in your 90s, the risk is 1 in 3. But by the time you reach 100, it's about 1 in 2 people have dementia. Yeah. And we find that, in fact, see, when we look at the risk factors, the modifiable risk factors, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, low physical activity. These risk factors are important in the people who develop dementia in their 60s, 70s, maybe early 80s. But as you grow older and older, the relationship with these risk factors also goes down to some extent. So when you're looking at a centenarian, we find that, in fact, it's very difficult to actually pick significant risk factors. And we think that there's a strong genetic component to it. But also, I think aging itself, because the biggest risk factor for dementia is aging. And there are a number of things that are happening in all our organs as we age. And in our 90s, certainly, the reserve in many of these organs has gone. Because we have a kind of a reserve for most of these organs. So by the 90s, late 90s, that reserve is minimal. And we call this a kind of a frailty process. So that essentially what it means is that even though the reserve is gone, people, if things are going okay, they still manage. But some crisis happens, like they have an infection, like COVID, for example, killed a lot of older people. Because any crisis that happens, then actually they don't have the capacity to bounce back from that. And that takes them very quickly, rather than a younger person who's able to cope and recover.
Correct. You've also had so much of experience in different cultures. Is sort of, healthy brain aging better in some cultures?
Yeah.
Or
so
society?
That's interesting. Interesting that you asked that, because we have been, what we tried to do actually as part of our work is that we have developed different consortia, which basically is bringing various studies from around the world, similar studies. Like we have a study called the Memory and Aging Study, where we recruited a little over 1,000 people between the age of 70 and 90, and we followed them for 15 years. And there are similar studies from around the world. And so we formed a consortium called the Cosmic Consortium, which basically is an acronym for a consortium with memory problems. And there are now 57 studies in that consortium from all continents. And in fact, I think over 40 countries are represented, including there are a couple of studies from India as well as part of that, but including Latin America, a few studies from Africa, a lot from Asia, but also a lot from Europe and North America. So that is one place where we've been trying to look at interethnic differences. And there are some interethnic differences. I mean, our focus has been dementia, of course. We don't look at all aspects of aging, focus is dementia. We look at aging in general, health in general as well. And we find that, yes, there are, in terms of overall prevalence, I think what is happening is that previously we used to think that there are certain kinds of dementia, like vascular dementia, was more common in some countries, Eastern countries like Japan, China, Korea, that was more common there. Alzheimer's disease was more common in European countries or North American countries. But that difference is gradually being eroded, really. There is a more commonality as cultural practices change, food habits changing. So I think those differences are going to some extent. Certainly longevity, there are differences in longevity. There are some countries where life expectancy is much greater. Like Japan is, of course, top of the tree there, where life expectancy for a woman is now over 86 years, for a man is 82 or so. And so so aging society in that sense. But many other countries are following close behind, really. I think there's some countries that are quite young, like Africa, where still people, life expectancy is much lower. But even India, I think now it's in the 70s, low 70s. So other countries are catching up. So that's where the world is headed. So we look at Japan, this is where we are headed in terms of what society or population is going to look like in the future. And then, so that itself will affect how many older people you'll have, and will affect how many people with dementia you will have, or people with frailty you'll have. But overall, when you actually look at the age-specific prevalence, we should call it, which means that you look at, say, 70-year-olds around the world, and see what is the risk of dementia in a 17-year-old in Japan versus North America versus India. And the difference is not huge. But there are some differences, but they're not huge differences. And but the risk factors may be somewhat different in different societies. Like we know that in some countries, like in say South Asia, in India, for example, we have a lot of diabetes, but diabetes is more risky. Produces greater problems, health problems in the Asian population, especially South Asian population, than it does in European population. So some of the risk factors work differently in different populations as well.
That's absolutely fascinating. And, you have so many aspects to your work. I could talk about this all day, but let's take a different turn to talk about
Sure.
your artistic venture. You have also written a wonderful anthology of poems called Migrants, Musings, and other offerings to an adopted land. How does this work encapsulate your experience as a migrant in Australia?
So I think that's very interesting because see, the migrant experience is very intense, and different people experience it differently. Often, I think there are phases, I think, in terms of sort of the initial phase of denial to some extent. You migrate to a new country, it's a totally different environment. The language is different, the interaction with people is different, the expectations as you move out are quite different, expectations at work are different, the kind of relationships that you form with people are quite different from what you're used to. And of course, you've left a lot of your loved ones behind, your family ties have been left behind, and many of the sort of cultural artifacts that you're so familiar with on a day-to-day basis that you take for granted, that you don't even notice, suddenly they're not there. And you find that it's a totally alien culture. So people cope with that differently. Some people try to deny it. Some people try to recreate that environment in the new place as well. So they develop their own cocoon. They only have friends from India, for example, this Indian migrants, so they'll have that kind of one, or they live in a place where they're surrounded by similar kind of people. That hasn't happened so much in Australia, but there's some places like London, for example, or Toronto, you might go to, people often live in that subculture, even when after they migrate. So people cope with it differently, really. And the emotion that you go through as you adapt to a new place also is very different. Say, starting off, and I started off as a single person, then getting married, having your children, raising your children, I think that gives you a different experience. And then having your grandchildren. Now we have the first grandchild. So it's all a different experience in terms of fitting it in a different culture, really. So I think that's really what I try to encapsulate in my poems, to see both in the alienation as well as the acceptance in new culture. And then, of course, leaving behind a particular culture and the kind of ambivalent relationship that you have with both. And you go back, you say, oh, this is wrong, or that is wrong with India, or this. But then you also, when you're away, that you say you have that longing, and you miss so many aspects that you are no longer available. So it's an ambivalent kind of a relationship that you have, both with your native culture as well as your adopted culture or society, really. And I think that is basically, I think, the fate, I should think, of every migrant, really, to some extent, that you basically, in a way, you do not belong in either place. You lose your original roots to some extent, but it's very hard to establish your roots in the new place. Maybe it takes a generation or two to really establish those roots.
Wonderful. I think that's really hit the nail on the head, that, it's you sort of miss your home country, yet you appreciate your new country. And, there are all these complexities that happens, especially moving at a fairly early age like you did. But taking this further, Dr. Sachdev, what do you think has the contribution been generally of the Indian diaspora to the medical sciences in Australia? Indians tend to lean towards these subjects. Is there a large Indian medical community?
Yeah. So I think the migration to Australia has been fairly selective. And of course, it's been determined by needs that Australia had. So it wasn't a service that they were providing to India. It was basically they were trying to man their own services. So in fact, in the 1970s, Australia had a need for doctors. And previously they used to look to the UK to import doctors. And then, of course, some would come from New Zealand. But then there was a shortage. And they then decided to open it to other migrants. And they got a lot from India. So the earlier migration of doctors was in the 70s. Then in the 80s, not that much migration happened of doctors. And in fact, I came in late 80s. I came via New Zealand because it was very difficult to come directly from India to Australia as a medical practitioner. And there were considerable hurdles as well. Even when you came here, there were many hurdles in terms of establishing your registration and then getting a career established. But in the 90s, things changed again. In the late 90s, and especially because, again, there was a shortage. So they invited a lot of doctors, especially, in fact, I work in psychiatry, neuropsychiatry. In psychiatry, actually, there has been a lot of migration of psychiatrists from India to Australia. And in fact, a lot of public psychiatry in Australia is manned by Indian psychiatrists, so psychiatrists of Indian origin. At least there are a few hundred of us in that sense. Now, and also general practices. And originally many of these general practices, the people who came, they were in general practices in rural or remote areas. But then they served some years there and they moved to cities. Usually that's what happens, that people start off in a rural area and then move to a city. So we have a lot of GPs, as we call them, who are primary care physicians, who are of Indian origin. That's a huge number, really. So, but most of the roles have been service roles. They have not been in academia or in research so much. That's been a little bit more difficult to crack. And I was fortunate because I came at an earlier age and I did some of my training here. So I was able to do that. But I think if you come as a specialist, migrant as a specialist, and if you're in a service role, then it becomes more difficult to get into academia if you're interested or set up a research profile. But we're seeing that change with second generation Indians now, because the earlier doctors and all had their children who were also doctors. And they're now moving into different professions. They are also getting into academia. So things are changing. I think the impact will come. There have been some prominent scientists from India, but they came into universities for PhDs, postdocs, and they made significant contributions. And we've seen, of course, some mathematicians, economists, who are quite prominent, who made significant contributions. But I think in medical research, still relative to the number of Indian doctors we have in Australia, it's been less of an impact. But I think that is changing. And the second generation is definitely changing that more rapidly, I think.
Well, slowly and steadily, I think that change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are not many incentives for exchange, I must also say, between India and Australia in medical research. There are some grants available, but focus is often on high tech, on emerging technologies, that sort of thing, really. And medicine, traditional medical specialties don't get much of a say in those kind of exchanges. And there are not many scholarships, fellowships available for exchange between the two countries. So hopefully that will change as well in the future.
That was actually my final question, Dr. Sachdev, is, you said that, research is still coming up, this community making a mark in research. So would you say that what would you say is the potential of the medical sciences communities in India and Australia to cooperate together to build capacity on both sides?
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, I must say that medical science in Australia is pretty advanced. I think it's up there with most other countries. In fact, Australia, to some extent, for its size, I think punches above its weight in terms of research output, in terms of patents in medical research. So this is one area of strength that Australia has. And of course, India has a huge workforce and sort of intellectual capital. And the two definitely can benefit each other in that sense. And I think the recognition to some extent has not been there. And I think most Indians have looked to, I think, the US. And earlier it used to be the UK, and then, of course, later the US in terms of intellectual collaboration to some extent. And Australians also actually haven't looked to India to the same degree in terms of intellectual capital. Although now they're changing away, certainly for IT, engineering, electronics, that sort of thing. Certainly, India is the flavor of the month, really, in terms of getting IT professionals, etc. But on software technology. But I think for medical science and science in general, that really Australia has not looked towards India. And I think that's where we need more cultural exchange, really, to be able to establish those bonds.
Well, Dr. Sachdev, thank you so much. I think, well in time, in time we will develop these relationships where there is lacking. India and Australia is really moving at a fast track. And I think they've prioritized each other, so wishing everybody the best. And, thank you for being with us and taking out the time.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I'm sure this relationship, Australia-India relationship, has a bright future. And I think now it's just coming to its the major part of limelight, really. Yeah.
Correct, and soon I'm sure it shall happen. But thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating, the variety of work that you've done, at a personal level as well as your professional level. So it was really a privilege for us to have you with us, and I hope to have you on again very soon. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure for me. Thank you.